afternoon, sir. Could we interest you in some chocolate?
Chocolate? Did you say chocolate? Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
How did chocolate become so famous? Its power so ingrained in our soul, evoking feelings of erotic love. When did this ancient treat entrance children worldwide? When and why did we decide to bastardize it so much that it has now become mere bricks of sugar and fat? What are the scary and saddening practices occurring even today? We will break all of that down, but first, let's start with chocolate's history. We know that the Mesoamericans enjoyed chocolate as a drink originally, not as hot chocolate, but instead in a more savory form. Unfortunately or fortunately for the ancient Mesoamericans, they did not have access to the refined sugars we love to plague ourselves with today. The first example we have of the chocolate drink comes from the ancient Moquea. Although we do not know as much about the Moquea as we do the Olmecs or the Aztecs, we do know that they primarily lived along the coast of Mexico as early as 1900 BC. A second discovery was made in Veracruz, Mexico, which used to be the home of the Olmecs. During an archaeological dig in Veracruz, they found a vessel of sorts which at one time contained the cocktail of cocoa. After some diligent testing, it was determined that the vessel was at least from around the year 1750 BC. According to the testing from the residue within the vessels, it was determined that the cocoa drink they enjoyed was quite different from our own. We like to only use the seeds, which we dry, roast, and grind into a powder to create cocoa. From there, we doctor it up with cocoa liquor, unidentifiable white sugar, and cheap vegetable fats. However, the Mesoamericans had a far more holistic approach. We know that they actually utilized the white pulp and the natural sugars within it to create a sort of cocoa alcoholic beverage by fermentation. In fact, the seeds were an afterthought for quite some time at the infancy of cocoa beverages. It was the pulp who reigned supreme. Something similar to this drink is still being fermented today in parts of Latin America. It was not until 400 AD that the Mesoamericans, primarily the Mayans, finally used the beans to create the famously frothy drink associated with the Aztecs. This intriguing discovery was made at an ancient Mayan tomb in modern-day Rio Azul. The vessels within the tomb were adorned with the ancient Maya language, the Maya glyph. The glyph, which consisted of various letters, numbers, and images, explained the creation of the use of cocoa. Further investigation of the glyphs has told us that cocoa was not only used for everyday enjoyment, but also held a special status for religious ceremonies. By the time the Maya came along, they were using cocoa in a way very much similar to our own. The seeds were dried, roasted, ground, then finally whisked with chili to create a very bitter and spicy potion. Take a crack at one of those next time you have severe allergies. As we fast forward to the 15th century AD, we come to the Aztecs, who are often mislabeled as the fathers of chocolate. As we have already discovered, chocolate was being enjoyed by other Mesoamericans over 1,000 years before the Aztecs used it. This did not come about until the Aztec Empire began its growth through conquest of parts of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs rapidly associated cocoa with their serpent god. According to the Aztecs, he was much like the Greek god Prometheus, who was punished for sharing a gift of the heavens with mortals. Instead of fire, it was cocoa he chose to share, and for that he was cast out by the other gods. The Aztecs also saw symbolism within the cocoa pod itself. They believed removing the seeds from the pod was akin to removing a heart from a human chest. I'd hate to find out what the human equivalent of drinking chocolate was. The Aztecs considered the Mayans' way of enjoying chocolate to be extremely strange. The fact that the Mayans loved to make a warm, bitter, and spicy drink confused the Aztecs. They chose to go down a more similar path to our modern-day enjoyment of chocolate. They decided to make their drink cold, sweet, and filled with added flavors. For example, vanilla, allspice, and honey were just some of the items which were frequently added to the brown beverage. Sadly, for the current Aztec overlords, they could not grow cacao themselves near the capital city. Instead, they had to import the cacao from Mesoamerican lands they had folded into their vast empire. Aztec traders would fill woven backpacks full of cacao and trek all the way back to the capital city to be sold. Cacao quickly became a large part of the empire's economy and even quite often was used as currency. The demand for chocolate grew so great that cacao was demanded consistently as a tribute from neighboring lands. Due to this travel time and scarcity of chocolate, it was reserved only for royalty and the very wealthy, much unlike the Mayans who enjoyed it as an everyday part of life. All sweet things must come to an end, however, and another new overlord, the Spanish, saw to that. Soon after Cortez and his men had defeated the Aztecs, they quickly catapulted to the top of the cacao tribute trade, demanding that the surrounding conquered peoples give cacao to them as a regular tribute or tax. Once cacao made its way to Spain, the thirst for the new beverage became insatiable. It did not take long for the Spanish to enslave and force the labor of millions of workers to grow, process, and export cacao to Spain for a cheap price. Once chocolate switched hands from the Aztec to the Spanish, the flavor preference quickly changed, much as it did between the Mayans and the Aztecs. The people of Spain disliked the bitterness that came with the chocolate drink. Cinnamon, sugar, and other spices were added to the drink, which gave birth to hot chocolate. For nearly 100 years, the Spanish kept a monopoly on chocolate before the craze for its silky sweetness spread across Europe like the bubonic plague. At first, chocolate was kept away from the poor of Europe, bouncing from one royal court to another, becoming an aristocratic treasure. That continued until the rapid industrial revolution swept the world. Europeans did not hesitate to grow the cacao on plantations all around the world. The labor force for this new crop became an issue as well, since the Mesoamerican labor force began to perish in droves from European sicknesses. What was the solution to this? You've guessed it. Vast amounts of slaves were being brought from Africa in order to meet the demand for labor. For nearly 200 years, this slave labor carried on to meet the demand for chocolate and keep prices down. From there, several household names began making quote-unquote improvements to chocolate for the world. Henry Nestle came up with a powdered milk product that was commonly used to create chocolate treats. This eventually led to a partnership with a chocolatier named Daniel Peter, and the Nestle company was born. Cadbury had been making their famous chocolate eggs ever since 1875. They could do this thanks to a new formula for cocoa butter that was able to withstand being molded into various shapes and sizes. Milton S. Hershey came roaring into the chocolate game in the year 1893. He bought a large amount of processing equipment and first started the Lancaster Caramel Company. The caramel and chocolate candies were so loved they started selling in bulk. Later, he sold the company for a titanic sum of $1 million, which is approximately $32 million in today's money. He used the newly obtained capital to start the Hershey Chocolate Company, and the rest, as they say, is history. Although chocolate was enjoyed as a bitter drink by Mesoamericans for nearly 2 millennia, it quickly thrust itself in the world's limelight. In such a short time, it has become a staple in our lives, holidays, and history. We must now turn our gaze upon what chocolate production is like today and how it affects our environment and our health. Have you ever questioned where or how the chocolate you grab off the shelf comes to you? Much like a lot of goods we consume and buy in the United States, the answer may not please you. Around 2/3 of our cocoa comes from West Africa. And I'd hate to cast a storm cloud over our beloved sweet. However, you must know that our chocolate is very commonly collected by child labor, or in other words, slaves. Many of these children are tricked into meeting kidnappers or are just outright stolen in broad daylight. often sold for a mere $50. The malevolent truth is, unlike most crops we buy, we do not really know where our cocoa powder comes from. When you eat chocolate, there's an overwhelming chance it comes from the Ivory Coast, where these child slaves are commonly used. Cadbury, Mars, and Nestle have yet to guarantee their chocolate is bereft of child labor. They all claim the issue is an issue of the industry itself and not an issue of their corporations. Humphrey Hawksley from the BBC decided to investigate this matter for himself to find answers not hidden behind company spokespersons. Here is an excerpt of what he found quite rapidly in the beginning of his investigation. So I set off to find out what was going on. A drive of hundreds of miles from the parched bushland of Mali to the lush jungle of the Ivory Coast. I had thought that finding children labor would be difficult. I talked to contacts, gathered phone numbers, spent hours of preparation. In the end, I needed none of it. After a 30-minute drive from our hotel along the main road to Simfra, we turned into a village, drove through a dirt track, past a cocoa plantation, and saw gangs of children coming towards us. They wore grubby, torn t-shirts and carried machetes. Their heads hung in confusion. It was a Wednesday morning. The oldest was 13 years old. The others didn't know their age. The youngest was probably 6 or 7. As we talked to them, another gang passed us on their way to work. Then their boss turned up, on a bicycle, looking for them. He was only 15 himself. It turned out the boys were shunted between maize, coffee, and cocoa farms, depending on the season. If they were paid, it was the equivalent of £1 a day, between 10 of them. We spent all the time bent over the field, one said. It's terrible, said another. Hot, tiring work. If child labor is so easy to find, the numbers might be in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions. You can see how this issue needs to garner more attention than it does. One of the children he interviewed even said this: I don't know how one human being can treat another in the way they treated me. Clearly, this is a non-necessity to have in an industry that merely provides us desserts. This is a growing problem that the world seems to constantly turn a blind eye to. Whether it be the creation of smartphones to sewing our clothes, child and slave labor seems of little importance. According to the World Cocoa Foundation, in 2007, some 50 million people around the world depended on cocoa as a source of livelihood. Next time you're in the store stocking up with some ancient Mesoamerican treat, take a second and make sure it's fair trade. It's a small price to pay in order to make a big difference. Chocolate itself can have a wide variety of impacts on your health, some being quite beneficial and others not so much. Chocolate is an excellent source of riboflavin, vitamin B12, and the dietary minerals manganese, phosphorus, and zinc. Chocolate is a good source of calcium, magnesium, and iron. Sounds great, right? Eat chocolate, stay healthy, be your happy self. Well, according to researchers, it's not quite that simple. When it comes to humans, too much chocolate consumption can lead to your chances of developing kidney stones due to high amounts of oxalate. According to the World Health Organization, one of the leading causes of indigestion in children could be linked to chocolate consumption due to the amounts of lead found within it. On a lighter note, if you need a slight pick-me-up, chocolate has got your back, since it is a good source of caffeine. Obesity and weight gain are also commonly associated with chocolate, usually that of the milk chocolate kind when consumed in large quantities. Now, if we could move on to animals for a short while. Have you ever wondered why dogs, cats, and other animals can die from eating the coveted treat? Turns out it's due to something called chocolate poisoning, or scientifically known as theobromine poisoning. This poisoning can be caused by an overdose reaction to the xanthine alkaloid theobromine, found in chocolate, tea, and some sodas. It turns out that we can withstand this poisonous onslaught due to the fact we are able to metabolize it quite a bit quicker than our furry friends. For them, it can be catastrophic, causing vomiting, sweating, and eventually heart attack and death. Be sure to keep those adorable Cadbury eggs away from man's best friend. Who makes the most chocolate? What kind of money is made? Just how rich are these chocolatiers? Let's explore. The chocolate industry as a whole makes around $50 billion a year worldwide. That's a lot of Wonka bars. Europe and the United States make up the majority of the chocolate industry, representing nearly 90% of all chocolate makers. The Hershey Company alone makes roughly $13 billion in annual sales, which equates to 2/3 of the US market. Despite chocolate being so famous and accessible around the world, a great deal of its cultivators don't even know what it's used for. Ironically enough, many of the farmers on the Ivory Coast have never even seen chocolate, let alone tasted it. One farmer who was interviewed said, "I heard it was used for flavoring and cooking, but I don't even know if that's true." This staggering reality is due to chocolate being far too expensive for the people who farm it, which once again brings us back to the issue of labor being used to gather our chocolate. It was discovered in 2009 that over 12,000 children had been trafficked in the chocolate farming practice. They also found that it is very likely that these children are working in harsh and abusive environments. The malice does not end there, sadly. In a more recent study in 2017, it is believed that there are more than 2.1 million children involved in the cocoa farming, most of which have to carry heavy loads, cut down forests, and are exposed regularly to harmful pesticides. Although industry leaders have finally stepped in to help, there has not been much headway. In April 2018, the Cocoa Barometer report stated, "Not a single company or government is anywhere near reaching the sector-wide objective of eliminating child labor, and not even near their commitments of a 70% reduction of child labor by 2020. Thankfully, fair trade initiatives came along in order to attempt to combat the issue. Fair trade is grounded in 3 core beliefs. First, producers have the power to express unity with consumers. Secondly, the world trade practices that currently exist promote the unequal distribution of wealth between nations. Lastly, buying products from producers in developing countries at a fair price is a more efficient way of promoting sustainable development than traditional charity and aid. Fair trade has achieved some of their goals in creating a better environment for workers in developing countries. Thanks to the increasing demand for chocolate, more and more farms are appearing. With the growth of the farms brings with it the shadow of more child labor. These communities are stricken with poverty and have no schools to help aid for a better future. It is clear to see how multivariate the issues around our food can be. A deep understanding needs to be shared with this world of consumption we live in. The demand for products to be supplied and of low cost beckons a host of terrible consequences. The blame does not fall on the ignorant. It lies with those who learn the truth but choose to keep their blinders readily intact. Much of this I did not know, nor did I intend to discover. This is not an issue we can solve overnight, but is one we can start talking about. This is yet another example of how we can save the food industry with our educated choices. When future generations look back, we should want them to say we drove out the shadow of greed, slavery, and poverty, that we chose the harder path to remain steadfast and keep our gaze fixed upon the industry's practices. Perhaps this illustrates that we are privileged enough to argue amongst ourselves over trifles, whilst the world that supplies our taken for granted comforts lies in ruin. If you like what you learned, please like and subscribe. If you didn't learn anything, we thank you for joining us. And remember, your food choices impact the world and its future.